Hello there. In terms of sheer size, Te Tai Tonga is by far the country's largest single electorate, taking up the entire South Island, as well as Stewart Island, the Chatham Islands, and parts of Poneke Wellington. So this week we're going to be focusing specifically on Te Tai Tonga in the public gallery. Te Tai Tonga is a fascinating electorate for a number of reasons. First of all, it is physically our largest by a long shot. It's 4 times larger than Balclutha Southland, which is the next largest electorate that we've got. And it covers an area that literally runs from Wellington to Stewart Island, out to the Chathams and any kind of little island that's littered out there underneath Stewart Island. It's huge. And there's a really important reason for that. Our electorates are broken down based on population, and they get updated every few years based on population movements. It's one of the reasons why somewhere like Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland has so many, but the South Island only has one, because that's where the population is. 76% of the overall population of Aotearoa lives in the North Island, but 86% of the Māori population live in the North Island. Essentially, Te Tai Tonga represents 14% of the population. And that's a huge number of people to deal with in a huge area. It means that the challenges that the local MP has to deal with could be completely different from, say, Poneke Wellington's needs, all the way down to Otepoti Dunedin's needs. They're very different communities. They have very different issues that pop up. They need somebody who can represent all of them. Over its history as well, we've seen some really interesting trends come through. So, for example, while New Zealand First Labour and the Māori Party have all held the seat at some point in time since its inception in 1996, they've always voted Labour with their party vote. The vast majority of it has always gone to the Labour Party. We saw some really weird stuff come through, though, in the last 2 elections, 2014 and 2017. The National Party actually got nearly 15-16% of the party vote in those electorates, or that electorate, singular. It's so big, it covers 16 of the general election electorates. But yeah, the National Party got 15% in those last 2 elections. It couldn't break 3% in the 2020 election. So it means that you've got people out there voting very specifically and very strategically, which is fantastic to see because that's how MMP was designed to work. This election, though, is a little different. For a start, there's only 2 candidates that have been announced that are running for the electorate. You've got the incumbent, Rino Terakatini, who is a Labour MP. He is number 21 on the list. And normally it would be a fairly safe assumption he'll do well in the seat, and on that list ranking, he should get back into Parliament based on current polling. But there's only one other person currently announced to be up against. It will literally be a choice of 2 different candidates. You don't have any vote splitting. Takuta Ferris, who's running for Te Pāti Māori, is an expert in kapahaka. He's been a coach for years that have taken teams to Matatini. He has done a lot of work around things like traditional carving, storytelling. He's really well known in the community, and he ran for the party as well in the 2020 election, so he's already got a little bit of a profile within a very, very large area. The issues that crop up here, though, are really, really fascinating. Every electorate is different and has different needs. And to look into it a little bit closer this time round, we're going to be talking to Scout, who's on the Māori electoral roll within Te Tai Tonga. This is where they get to vote. But because it's such a large electorate, there's questions like, have they ever actually met their MP? Could they tell me what the MP stands for? Is there some weird thing going on with just how respected the MP is? Because the MP's father was also an MP for the electorate before 1996 when the name change kicked in. It's a really, as I said, fascinating electorate to look into. I wanted to start by looking at the issues that were really specifically facing Te Tai Tonga and its residents, but well, it's kind of interesting that there's not a huge amount of information out there online for a couple of reasons. The first is it's such a large electorate. As I said before, the issues that are going to be facing voters in somewhere like Poneke Wellington are going to be completely different to voters in other parts of the electorate. So finding a specific issue that stands out, that's unique to that electorate, is really difficult. The other thing that's really interesting to look at in this is the fact that in terms of issues facing voters, you've got some that are facing all sorts of problems everybody else is facing, like the cost of living crisis. A recent One News poll showed that for the majority of New Zealanders, the cost of living crisis for them was currently the most pressing issue with this upcoming election. And there is no doubt that that is going to be the same for Te Tai Tonga. Even though as an electorate it has a larger median family income than any of the other Māori electorates, that income is still significantly lower than the rest of the country. Those kind of pressures can be really problematic. Now, looking for clues into this as well, I also did a bit of a search through the social media profiles of both the candidates, and well, they were kind of lacking in this area, to be honest. Rino, who is dealing at the moment with the Ministry of Trade as the Minister for Trade for Māori, he's been dealing a lot with international delegations and that kind of generalized work, and that's what his social media profile has been focusing on. Takuta, though, has been focusing more on things like education around what te tiriti means, but there's very little in there about what the actual issues are that are facing voters within Te Tai Tonga. So when I sat down with Scout and wanted to find out a little bit more, I think it's really important to remember that these are the issues that Scout feels is important. And Scout's got some really interesting connections to their community. There's connections to places like Kohanga Reo. That's really important. There's work that Scout has done with a whole bunch of different organisations, including the Human Rights Commission. There's a whole bunch of different facets that for Scout are really important. So let's find out what Scout feels are the biggest issues facing Te Tai Tonga.
What's really important to me down here is local expertise, local knowledge, and policy that benefits us locally. We get a lot of policy that comes out of Wellington or Auckland. It's designed for Wellington and Auckland. A lot of the time, the people who are implementing the policy haven't even seen how it will be implemented down here. It's just ideas that may as well come from overseas. They're often that disconnected. It's really important to me to have really local representation, and so I actually feel quite disappointed to be in the electorate that I'm in. I'm in this catch-22 where if I leave the Māori electorate, then I don't get anything out of it. But if I stay in it, I'm also not getting anything out of it because we need more people to join it in order for it to grow, to have enough people that we actually get that local representation. But I've said it on here before, the electorate is just far too big to get any benefit out of. We're the second largest city. I mean, if you count Wellington, we're the third largest city in the electorate. But that's the thing, like our electorate spans from part of Wellington to Nelson, to the West Coast, to Christchurch, to Dunedin, to Invercargill, to bloody Milford Sound and Stewart Island. I feel like, yeah, we cover the Chathams as well. And so it's just not practical for the MP of or the candidates of this electorate to be anywhere. The only ever candidate from this electorate that I've ever met or seen at any events was Me Ture Ture, and she lives a 20-minute drive from me.
One of the most common issues that comes up when you're looking at Māori wards and Māori electorates from a Pākehā perspective is not quite understanding just how much the impact is on Māori communities. You might have an idea of it, or you might see snippets of it in terms of how it affects the general population. But because Māori outcomes are hugely inequitable in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of crime statistics, and those communities are well aware of those inequities, when it comes to government and the MP representation within government for those really large electorates, there are some issues that crop up automatically for many Māori voters around exactly what those outcomes are going to be from having somebody in government.
People talk a lot about postcode lottery, right? Like it's the whole reason that all the DHBs were amalgamated into Te Whatu Ora is this postcode lottery situation where the resources are all centered around one or two different places. There are services here that you can be referred to and your referral will be declined because they just don't have the capacity. Even if you need tests for a diagnosis that only that department can provide. There are people who are waiting way longer than they should, to the point that they're getting sicker because they can't get cancer healthcare. It is what happens when all of the decisions are made out of one well populated area. Those of us in less populated areas don't get the same quality of care or access to care. And we know that anywhere that there is a disparity in access to care or support, that it's going to be Māori who are worse off. It's going to be Māori who are worse affected. If Māori are more likely to be in poverty, then Māori are less likely to be able to afford private healthcare. And there are a lot of people down here resorting to private healthcare to get their needs met.
I also wanted to do a bit of digging into the candidates themselves. What makes a good candidate? What makes a good representative for Te Tai Tonga? Because there's been some fascinating names put forward in the past to represent various parties within that electorate. The Mana Party actually put forward the late great Georgina Byers, Aotearoa's first ever transgender MP. The Greens have put forward Materia Ture a number of times, and she represented Te Tai Tonga as a list MP in her last term in Parliament. But what about who's running now? Well, I reached out to the Green Party, an insider there, and asked them if they had any indication as to whether or not a candidate was even being put forward. And I got a laughing cry face emoji back as a response. So, yeah, that doesn't look too promising at the moment. And looking at the other parties, National has not run a candidate in this electorate for years, and it doesn't look like it's going to be one of the Māori electorates that they run a candidate in this time. So it could very well be a binary choice between the Māori Party candidate and the Labour Party candidate. And the two of them are very, very different. For example, Takuna is very much about Māoritanga, and he's very good at educating people around what te tiriti means and how that fits into the constitution that we work in at the moment, how that's very different to what we've sort of working around in terms of co-governance, a whole bunch of educational elements around what a tiriti-led country actually means. And if we look at what Reno is doing, well, he's focusing a lot at the moment with his role around things like New Zealand trade as the Minister of Trade for Māori. So he's dealing with delegations and trips all over the place and trade deals, but it means that neither of them at the moment have really put a bunch of information out there online around the issues that face their electorate specifically, which makes it really hard to work out how they're going to tackle those issues or what they bring to the table that we haven't already seen. Let's see what Scout's views are on them. Okay, let's start off with Reno.
Um, his first name is Reno. I can't. His surname starts with a T. I can never actually remember it. I'm actually just hopelessly bad at names. So if I haven't met somebody or engaged with them personally, it's really hard for me to hold their name in my head. I don't even know where he's based. I think he's Autotahi, is he? Um, I haven't seen him achieve anything for Ōtepoti. I haven't even seen him in Ōtepoti. That's the thing. I I worked for a political party. I have been politically active my entire adult life. I have attended political events. I have run for public office. And yet, despite being, that higher level of active than the general population, I've never seen my community MP, my electorate MP at any community events.
Reno spent a long time as a backbench MP. He's been in Parliament since 2011, and stories were coming out in, I think, 2018, 2019 about how he'd really like to step up and take a little bit more of the load that was available out there as an MP. Since then, he's taken on a few different portfolios, including Minister of Courts and Minister of Trade for Māori. And that means he works really closely with people like Damien O'Connor on getting international trade deals done. It means he's very busy in that field because that's a really detailed area. And that could bring into question just how much time and effort he can put into his role as an electorate MP. It is also pretty conservative for a Labour Party MP under both the Marriage Equality Act and the Abortion Reform Act. He voted against those, and those were conscience votes, so it was up to him how he chose to vote. But for a Labour Party MP, both of those issues, the way he voted was much more on the conservative side of things. If we flip the coin a little bit, though, and we look at what Takuta has to offer and what his perspective is, we actually kind of get an idea from the 2000 general election campaign. There's a great interview that was done by Scotty Morrison on the show Marae, where the two of these guys sat down and faced off about big issues. For Takuta, he was more worried about inequality within the electorate and poverty being a big issue. He felt at the time, while we were in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, that the government was not doing enough to particularly support Māori enterprise and particularly support Māori families in Te Tai Tonga when everybody was doing it tough. But when you've got already a disparity in the amount that people are earning or their ability to earn or the areas that they're working in, how heavily they were hit by COVID, then perhaps you need a different approach to being able to tackle that issue. And that's why at the time those were big issues for him. Now, in this campaign, he hasn't said very much publicly about those issues, but it's pretty fair to guess that those are still standard issues that he's concerned about. Let's see what Scout's opinion is of the big competitor on the block.
It's they're definitely issues that are affecting everybody in the country. We do disproportionately see it in our Māori communities. And the thing is, down here, we don't have the same initiatives to support our Māori communities that you would see in other more populated areas. Um, I personally do see poverty. I see, you know, kids without lunch. I see, you know, kids who don't have a good jacket or weather appropriate shoes. It does happen down here, and it is a really big issue. And at the same time, I don't see the same level of media attention or social support for the people down here. We are too far away to tangibly be helped by a lot of the anti poverty organizations, even, beneficiary advocates. We don't get any help from them. They're all in Auckland. We're on the other end of the country.
One of the other things that Scout points out is that when you're dealing with media and Māori politicians, there's a higher different standard to what Pākehā politicians can get away with. And when you're in the middle of a Māori electorate, those differences become really apparent. It makes people much more inclined to not feel bad about not delivering what's needed for the members of those electorates.
It's so hard to tell. I don't think it's just what happened to Materia. I think that we've seen this pattern of our wahine and Takatapui Māori MPs over the last, 5 years and more be ostracized and be bullied out and be made victim to ongoing racism. And it's coming from everywhere. There Our local paper ran full page stories on the front page, full massive stories about every single MP scandal that came from a wahine Māori MP. But then there was a scandal of quite a similar magnitude from the National Party. I can't even remember the guy's name now. He got about this much in the sidebar on the third page. It's one of those situations where we only hear about what our Māori MPs are doing when they're naughty. And when our Pākehā MPs are being naughty, we don't hear about it.
So to me, this all begets a question. What is the point of being on the Māori electoral roll if you don't feel like you're getting anything out of it, if you don't feel like you're getting any fair representation, if you feel like your electorate is too large to be useful, or if your MP is not able to get back to you when you need them to or want them to? And even then, your MPs are going to be held to a higher standard than other MPs. What's the point of being on the Māori electoral roll in a Māori electorate like Te Tai Tonga.
It's more that we don't see any tangible impact of being on the Māori roll. If we're in a situation where we need support and advocacy, everybody in the country is entitled to ask the electorate MP for support. I've never even gotten a reply from Reno's office when I've included him on any correspondence about electorate issues. I think people see the size of the electorate and think, what can I actually get out of this? What is the point? And I think they're right. That there isn't really a point other than, trying to mass migrate onto the roll. But we're not going to be able to do that for another 5 years. Our Māori community is very disparate here. There's a lot of urban Māori who come from other places. And it's hard. A lot of us, how do I phrase this? Another Māori in my community a couple of weeks ago described me as a new Māori because they'd not met me before. It's not that I'm new to being Māori. I've been Māori my entire life, but they'd not met me before. I wasn't a part of the community. And there's a lot of people who are Māori and don't have that access to community because a lot of the communities are really insular. A lot of them are very small, disparate, and little pockets around the place. It's a very predominantly Pākehā place. It doesn't mean everyone's Pākehā. It does mean that the predominant culture is Pākehā. And so I couldn't tell you how many Māori there are in the South Island. But remember, we're talking about the entire South Island here, and part of Wellington, and the Chathams, and Stewart Island. It's massive. There's no way that you can know every Māori in that massive space. There's no way you can represent every Māori in that massive space. So I don't know what percentage of the population are actually on the Māori roll. I know a lot of people who are on the general roll because they don't get anything out of the Māori roll.
So, what skills then are needed to be an effective MP for an electorate that is so large and ungainly in its size? Well, that's a really tough one. I don't have an answer to that. Scout's answer is probably even less practical than my not having an answer, but there's a logic to it.
They need to have a superhuman ability to split themselves into 6 parts so that they can adequately represent the local needs of the entire community. Just a little thing. It's if we're gonna actually honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and we're gonna actually do the partnership thing as we agreed to do way back when we signed it, then we need to have adequate representation. The way that it is working now, I firmly believe, is a breach of the Tiriti o Waitangi because we do not get adequate representation. So, yeah, the first thing that we need is for the MP to have a superhuman ability to split themselves into 6 parts and to accurately and adequately represent the entire community. And, that is actually my serious answer as well, that until they can actually come to community events, until they can show up in the community, which they can't do when they have to represent everything from Wellington South, it's just not adequate. I think that it's at the detriment to the electorate. I think that it would be a positive thing for the electorate if we had a manageable size of an electorate. When you have one MP who's representing like half of a city and they've got all those portfolios, it works. Sometimes there's a bit of detriment to the electorate, but it tends to work because they don't have that massive space that they have to care for. And it's not that there's more people in the electorate, because if there was disproportionate amount of people in the electorate, then there'd be smaller electorates. But you can't be in 6 places at once.
Like everybody else in Aotearoa, people of Te Tai Tonga have 2 votes, and the second vote goes for the party, which Labour has won hands down every election since 1996. And fascinatingly, in the last election, National didn't even break the 3% mark of party votes in the electorate after two elections where they were around 15%. It was really fascinating to sit down and see this kind of data set come through.
The only parties that ever campaign in Te Tai Tonga are Labour, Te Pāti Māori, and the Greens. National has never stood a candidate. They're not interested in campaigning. They're not interested in campaigning for the Māori vote. It's not important to them. And so I think that Māori voters and the Māori electorate are seeing the people who do bother campaigning and seeing that the Labour Party are the best option. But I think it is a case of who we see. You know, if we are on the Māori roll, then we are usually getting sent information about the candidates. They'll reach out. They'll send a form letter to all of the candidates. Haven't gotten anything yet this year, which is interesting. Usually it happens before now, but we don't usually hear from the National Party because they don't give a shit about us.
Think of this election and watching Te Tai Tonga during the election as watching a black hole absorb light. It's large, the mass is huge, and everything that goes past it is going to get sucked in. And that's kind of how it feels watching this particular election. The electorate, as you've heard, is massive and unwieldy and kind of unfair because of just how physically large it is. There's other factors that come into play as well. From a Pākehā perspective, who don't really necessarily pay much attention to Māori politics, there's a lot of nuance that people tend to miss, like the fact that our system that we use, the Westminster system, is very much a colonial system. And Māoridom and Tino Rangatiratanga do not necessarily fit within that system particularly well. And then our media also plays up an awful lot around how Māori are expected to behave in Parliament. And those are really big issues when it comes to voting for anybody. But it's particularly problematic when it comes to voting for Māori because it's about representation not just of their beliefs and ideals, but who represents them as well. Because that reflects back on everybody and our media, which is never a good thing when that happens. We've also got other things coming into play like poll results. Labour's dropping in the polls at the moment, Te Pāti Māori have been rising. That might have an effect. You've also got other issues like the fact that the incumbent party has been in power for 107 years. Well, been in parliament, not in power. That would be horrifying. But Te Pāti Māori was born out of dissatisfaction with Labour. There are definite differences between them both, from a political point of view, from a policy point of view, that is really hard sometimes to pick up from the outside if you're not paying attention to the detail. Either way, what we do know is probably going to happen on election 14 is Labour is going to take out the party vote. Everything else is up in the air. Everything else is up for grabs. And we're going to sit back on the 14th and be completely engrossed by what goes on. How people are going to choose to vote down there, that's a mystery. What the results are going to be is also a mystery. And how on earth a candidate is going to be able to handle the pressure of that large an electorate, that is one very interesting mystery we get to solve together.